I won't say that this time. But the idea is the following: is to just put this way, this here, so there is a chance you guys can actually see what's in the board. The idea is to do something in two main topics, because recently, I mean, I gave it a rest, the whole thing on knot theory and math for a while, especially because in the circle here in Rio, I'm again the +1, and we decided that a good strategy to bring more members is to return to those more complex theoretical presentations I used to do. And it's true, since I began doing them, we have like 6 visitors per meeting, and most of them are gonna send their forms now. So it's been an effective idea, especially because we have that, like I have this ethics of always trying to present the most sophisticated thing as a problem and not like some sort of theoretical construction that already makes perfect sense. So what I tried to do, and I wanted to reconstruct that with you guys now, and then move forward, what I wanted to do is to reconstruct the history of the problem of organization. So it's a historical account of how it came to be that organization became the field of problems for politics, starting from ancient Rome to, I would stop at Lenin, the Bolshevik party, and then from there, if we do this really, I mean, my idea is to do this quite quickly, and then after that to jump ahead to one guy that I never cared for, but recently I found out reading other people that Jean-Paul Sartre did in his critique of dialectical reason a whole study connecting, basically thinking history as the history, modern history at least, as the history of modes of organization. So the relation between collectivity, group, fusion groups, organizations, institutions. He distinguishes all of them, and since I think he lacks one point that interests us, and that's basically why I will reconstruct historically the point, which is a thesis that now I can organize in a more clear way. Since he misses this point when he comes up with this dialectical account, it is, I would say, too secular, too easy, too reductive of the role of spirit, immortality, and things like this at the level of organization. Like whatever that those words mean, they touched upon something that connects to the autonomy of organizations, and without this dimension, his schema is made poorer, I think. So I didn't have much time to prepare, in the sense, I mean, it is quite prepared, that's why I can do it in a quick way, but I didn't have time to find the texts in English that I use as reference. So I will reference them just like as I remember the quotes, and then if you guys want, I can tell you where they are, and we can work with that. I can perhaps add that to the research update. So and you will also see that this is pretty much a reconstruction of the phenomenology of spirit from a particular standpoint, which is the standpoint of the concept of political body. Like, I found the oldest quote to this idea, this comparison between politics and anatomy or physiology or the body in general. Julia doesn't care much for this comparison.
Sorry.
No, don't worry. The oldest quote I found from this is by a guy called Menancius Agrippa, who was an old Roman counselor, like 500 years before Christ. And there is this thing that a guy called, I forgot where, but one Roman historian quotes Agrippa as the guy who, like, this is called the fable of Agrippa. So it's connected to him, right? It's interesting because it's worth mentioning that he was a guy who came from a plebeian family, but had a role in the aristocracy or whatever it was called back then. So he was kind of trapped between that. He feared he was not enough of a nobleman in the Roman world because of his origin. So it's interesting to see that it was a guy with that problem that came up with this fable. And the fable goes like this. There was a time in the distant past where the parts of a body didn't agree with each other as they do now. Each part has their own ideas and had their own voice. One day, some of the parts began to think that it was quite unfair that they had to work and worry to provide everything for the stomach, while the stomach would just lay there in the middle of the body without doing anything, only enjoying what was brought to it. So these parts conspired together and agreed that the hands would no longer lead the food to the mouth, that the mouth would no longer open for the food, that the teeth would no longer chew what they received. The stomach made revolutions in protest, but all the parts remained ferociously firm in the maintenance of the hunger, in order to bring the stomach into submission. However, soon these parts began to feel weak. Fadiga, the weariness became worse and worse until the point that then the stomach and all the rest of the body died of inanition, like lack of food, right? Then it was clear that the stomach only apparently cast aside had its own task in the deed, and it returned to the body as much as it received. It digested everything and gave ailment to the members by the means of the blood. So that's the fable. So you can see it's a very reactionary fable, right? Not reactionary, it's hard even to say that. Like, it's a fable about something that seems without function. Everything else has a function, and by this difference, it distinguishes itself from the lack of function. They segregate it and find out that the thing that had no function and seemed to enjoy only, in fact, had some function, and therefore they shouldn't have segregated or separated themselves from it, right? It's a funny idea because the stomach here is kind of a partial object. It's a part of the body that is a body of its own, and it enjoys alone. Everyone else works for everyone, but that part enjoys for itself. So they try to remove it and find out that by removing that, the harmony of the body melts away, right? But it's a fable that binds them. It's a political fable about, don't destroy, like, you look at the noblemen, they're just enjoying. Let's stop giving them things to enjoy. But then you find out that they're actually the governors. They distribute things, right? It's kind of a fable about the state, or whatever you want to call it. But the interesting thing is that this fable somehow got into Greece, and in the two main political treatises of Greek classic philosophy, Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics, you find reference to the metaphor of the body as the city, or the body as the body as a city in some way, and different ways to think this standpoint from which we can see the intelligibility that parts and the whole go together. So, for example, in the Republic, in the section called section 462a, Plato is debating sickness and health and the problem of justice. And he brings justice in precisely as that standpoint that we can achieve through reason, which allows us to see that people are to the city as members are to a body. And it's a really beautiful passage where he says, just as when my hand is hurt, the other hand is also hurt because they're part of the same body. Therefore, there is some sort of sympathetic logic binding together these apparently separate members when I consider them from the standpoint of my head or my unity. The standpoint of justice is something like the head that I can look at the world from and see that when one person suffers, the other person is also suffering. So the texture of the social space appears as a logical texture, one that has consequences for and identities and equivalences and relations, when I see it from the standpoint of justice. That's what justice is. So it has see, like, he needed the metaphor of the body in order to think. Now, the body is the relation between members and the whole, organs and the organism. This harmony is also valid for the city, where you have people with functions and the life of the city. But in order to see this as a whole and then adjust the parts in the whole, we need the idea of justice. It's like the head. Right? It's funny because then you have, let's say, this is, let's say, the funny, not funny, but the classic idea that Plato is more rational and Aristotle is more close to the life paradigm. So reason and idea. And with Plato, Aristotle returns to the same idea in the first pages of Politics to say that when we inquire what is more essential in a city, we find that from the standpoint of self-subsistence, meaning things that can remain themselves, people are just parts and the city is the body or the whole. Because if I remove a member from my hand, like my hand, out of my body, it dies. Whereas my body can be considered one thing and it remains unitary. And in the case of the city, it's the city that is the body and the people which are the parts, because if I remove a person from the city and cast them aside, they die. So the subsistence is actually the subsistence of the city. So from the idea of subsistence, which is something like, from the standpoint not of an idea, but of a logic of an organism, I can only see the whole when I look at the city. I cannot look at an individual. So when he says man is a political animal, is in the sense that the completion of it, of humans as animals, depends on this social dimension. If I exclude the polis, the city, the man from the city, it's no longer the animal that it is. It dies. Just like a hand stops being a hand and just loses both its function and its being, right? It deteriorates if you remove it from the body. The similarity between the two is that let me see if I can find something here. The similarity between the two is that they're both transcendental standpoints, right? The idea of justice or this essential being, right? The standpoint of being in the sense of being there, the unity, which is the standpoint of Aristotle. I want to see the city and people. How do they relate? How do the organized and the organization relate? Well, I need to go to the being of, in this sense of the being one of individuals. How is this unity guaranteed? Only within the city. Therefore, the city is truly the whole and the human is the part. In Plato, again, how do I see the relation between the organized and the city? The citizens and the city or whatever. Well, only when I take the standpoint of the idea of justice, from this standpoint, which is like the standpoint of the head of a city, I can see the harmony of the just a second. Yeah, I'm looking here for quotes because then we find Ephesians, right? Ephesians. We find quotes in the Bible that refer to back to this idea. So ancient Rome, we found it in Greece, in the Judaic paradigm. This is suspended because in the history of Judaism, the whole point is not to have iconography. So it's something like from Plato's idea, we keep the transcendental, but we don't. It cannot have an image. So something slightly different. It has a more of an enigmatic idea of unity of a community. But then in St. Paul, we find again the reference to this. I'm going to share my screen here just so you guys can read this. We find again the reference to this metaphor of the political body in two places. The 1 Corinthians, he says, just as the body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we are all baptized by one Spirit so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we're all given the one Spirit to drink. So even so, the body is not made up of one part but many. So he says, now you're the body of Christ and each one of you is a part of it. So Christ is the head of a body that all the community is constituting the parts, right? But then he realizes in the Ephesians, he brings in a paradox, and this is, let's say, the novelty of Christianity, because no longer the unifying principle that binds people to the common is transcendental. It's not an idea of justice nor the being of life, but a person, right? And he says this explicitly here when he says, let me see if I can find it here. He says, look, he says, instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. From him the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself in love, and each part does its work. But Christ is no longer seen like the head. This is you see the paradox, right? We're no longer speaking about concrete parts, abstract whole, right? And a transcendental mediator that's closer to the whole than to the parts, that binds the two together, gives us that point of view that binds the two together. We're now talking about concrete parts, and there is one of these parts, right, a concrete human, Christ, that unifies the rest of the parts. It's true, he's a particular form of mediator because he's supposedly half transcendental and half immanent to the world. But the problem, this paradox that Christ is both the body itself and the head, outside of the world and inside the world. The transcendental standpoint from which you unify things, but at the same time, one of the parts that is unified. This, let's say, begins the trajectory of how to think within the world this thing that is more than the sum of the parts, but also less than a totally different thing, right? Because we could say in the Greek world, what is more than the sum of the parts? The idea of justice, right? What is more than the sum of the parts? The organism, as considered as a harmonious standpoint, the very being of the organism. With Christianity, the idea comes into being that this mediator is within the world, not outside the world. And if we could call this, so we've seen, let's say, the pagan world with the Agrippa fable. In the Greek world, we have unification through reason. The mediator is reason, be it the concept of justice or the concept of existence. In the Judaic world, we have actually a mediation through meaning, but we can leave this aside for now. Then we have a Christian event where the problem of incarnation is precisely the incarnation of a man. So the incarnation of a mediation. So the organization needs a standpoint to see itself as organized, but this standpoint is also in the world. It's not outside. But then the Christian world comes, and this is actually played out for centuries and centuries as a big problem, because this is the doctrine of the two bodies of the king that guy Kantorowicz will study. The idea that you can now have a figure that mediates between this, let's say, the parts and the whole, is organized around the figure of the king, for example. And the big debate that there always was is the king, this duplicitous role of the king, where he is a man and he's also the embodiment of something more, right? Is this something more, something that is guaranteed to him by the church? It's because he's a man of the church, and because the church espouses this idea that he recognizes there something more, that he is something more, meaning it's actually the church that is mediating between the other world and this world, and, let's say, lending something to the king? Or is the king, because he's a king, incarnating something of the beyond? So the church oh my god, the church and the problem of kingship always was a tense one. And you can see that it's actually funny because the church's position is that the incarnation was not so fully, it was not secular. So it's not political, it's theological or religious, and you can metaphorize this excess of the city in politics, in the figure of the king, but only through the church. Whereas the position of the kings were, no, this is something that is in me. Like I am both these things. So this whole doctrine of the two kings, the two bodies of the king, where the king has a physical body and a body that is, let's say, himself as the mediator between the city as parts and the city as a whole, right? Or the kingdom as parts and the kingdom as a whole. Well, the modern event comes and does something very interesting to this, and I think that the best study on this is called The Royal Remains by a guy called Eric Sandner. And this is the point where I think a fundamental thesis appears that if you don't agree with it, you're neither Hegelian, nor can you really account for modern problems of organization. This is the reason why Zizek, I think, is so specially positioned to account for this. Because what Sandner analyzes together with that art historian T.J. Clark is that looking at the Marat painting, right? The whole, how is it? It's like this, right? You have a big painting where you have here a lot of darkness, and you have that guy here falling like this, right? In the tub, with a lot of darkness here on top, and he's dead here. My version of the Marat painting. What did T.J. Clark and then Sandner, reading Clark's article, realize? That the French Revolution was precisely fighting for the disfiguration of the king. Like, we want the excess of sovereignty, this thing that reigns over us, that is not us, to not be substantial. So, either to popular suffrage, either to the concepts of democracy, freedom, blah, blah, blah. It's all about desubstantializing the position of exception, right? But then there was this guy called Marat. He was the leader of the movement, and he dies. And Jean-Louis David, this painter, has the task of painting his friend's death. But you see, if he were to paint a big painting with Marat looking very posh and glorious, he would be painting the substance of this sovereignty, of this popular excess of whatever, in the figure of Marat, which is exactly what Marat was fighting against. So he couldn't paint Marat as a big figure, but he also could not paint Marat, because it was the chance to paint somebody from the people as an important figure. So he had to paint Marat as Marat's death, but he couldn't paint Marat's death as a glorious act. So his solution is that he paints the physical body, death here, dead, right? And in the top part of the painting, he just does like this really strong black part of the canvas, right? With a lot of paint. And here, if you can see the painting here. Right? You see how this upper part of the painting is really full of color, but with nothing. And the guy is just here, death, with like very pale and so on. And what Sandner realized in this is that he had to paint the physical body, and now the second body of the king, this dimension that figurated the excess, which, what is this excess? This position of mediation between this world and the parts and the whole, right? This thing that appeared as a figure with Christ, like appeared as an idea with Plato, appeared as a human figure with Christ. But it's funny because in Christ's time, it was one man, a unique man. In the kingdoms, in the time of kings, it was like one, it was like not any man, but some man, right? And with the French Revolution, it becomes anyone, because it's now the problem of popular power. So what Sandler realizes is that the excess that was transcendental in Greece, immanent but figured in a unique way in Christ, figured as a segregatory or hierarchical place in the royal paradigm, was even further incarnated into everyone after the French Revolution. Everyone in the doctrine of citizenship, of popular sovereignty, everyone is divided between themselves as parts and themselves as mediators between parts and the whole. When I vote, I'm not only voting for my own private interest, but whatever I do, even if I vote for my private interest, it will touch on the whole. So the whole point of the whole modern theory of politics is born precisely when somebody manages to think this issue. And the issue appears as a problem of the general will. It's the Rousseau problem. Like, I have particular wills, and I need to think sovereignty as the relation of particular wills that somehow exceeds this particularity, and it calls general will. And in such a way that this appears as a process of relation between wills and not as embodiment of somebody who is the general will, right? So the modern political problem is born, and this is what I mean by two positions that define everything. If you read this history in French Revolution as not the further incarnation of a problem, but the cessation of the issue, like if you basically retroact from our postmodern bourgeois world the idea that there is no such thing as this excess, there's only individual wills, and you reconstruct the whole history of religion as the history of a solution without a problem, there was never anything to be thought. They were just using mysticism to keep people with political power. Okay, if that's the case, when a regime appears that bars the role of religion in politics, the problems that came with it also cease. If you think religion was a thought of something, it was a way of grasping something, when religion is barred from organizing political life, the problems remain, but without the religious solutions. The problem being what to do with the fact, and Rousseau says this with all words, that the general will is not the same thing as the sum of all particular wills. Now, the funny thing is that the history of this in modernity, after Rousseau, you have one great thinker, I think, not right after, but you have Kant, but who tries to solve this issue with the moral law. The moral law is an attempt to find, like, we know that we cannot have a positive mediator between parts and the whole. So Kant tries to find a negative mediator, because practical reason is a negative standpoint. But if you follow, it's not like the idea of justice, but it's almost like Platonic in that sense. Reason, the very fact of reason has a negative existence, but this negative existence can bind the part and the whole with crazy effects, because it doesn't really bind me to the whole through my function in society. It binds me to the whole insofar as I am equal to everyone. So that's a novelty, right? In the Greek world, I was bound because I have a function, like a hand has a function, and my function serves the whole. If I look at it from the standpoint of justice, I will see this relation. Whereas the moral law will bind my behavior to the effects of the whole through a fact that reason is available to everyone. So it's a different...
Also to add to that, like the role of function completely disappears in the moral law, right? Because you have to treat all other rational individuals
as not as means.
Ends, not as means. So they cannot have a function for anything, right?
Exactly. And it's funny because, I mean, this is something, again, that if you look at the history that we're covering from a certain standpoint, you can keep the function of view, and if you look at it from another perspective, you see that what was at stake was always the functionless. Because Plato will think justice not only as a standpoint, but also as a pleasure, as a doctrine, a discipline that you can achieve, right? So there is something that was also useless, right? And again, if you go to the Christian event, it's not simply a guy who came with a knowledge. It's not the incarnation of somebody who knows what justice is. It's a guy who dies in the most unjust of ways, right? And he dies as let's say, exactly as somebody who has no function. He dies as a burglar, right? Somebody who's not welcomed in the harmonic society. And then in the Christian world, this seems like it's not the case, but it is again the case. Because the mediator is somebody who does nothing. Like everywhere where there was a king, there was also somebody saying, look at this idiot, he doesn't do anything. You know, anyone can do his job. So it's funny because, let's say, in the Greek world, so pagan, we have a sort of we had like the relation between the members with function and the stomach, which was the mediator. It has a function. So sorry, let me put it like this. You had members and you had the body, which was harmony, and the members all have functions, and they thought there was something without function, right? The stomach. But the whole moral of the story is you think that doesn't have a function, but it does have a function, right? So members have functions, the body is a system, and the stomach that looked like a functionless thing that people envied and resented because of it, it actually also had a function. So, but it was the mediator, right? So the mediator has a function. Then you come to the Greek world. You have the members who are thought in terms of function. You have the body as a system, a city or whatever, and the mediator is now an idea. And it's not really function, like it's not a part of the body anymore, right? We kind of incorporated the mediator, but it binds things together, but it, let's say, lacks the function here. In the case of Plato, at least. Idea or existence, right? It's funny because you could say that Plato binds members and body through non-function, and Aristotle binds by the idea of function itself, right? The very logic of a body, organisms, like treating things as the function that they have, the work that they do in relation. Plato does something different. Then in the Christian event, which is not the same as the Christian world, you have the members, you have the body, and you have a member here, which is Christ, which is precisely, he is, so this is transcendental here. He is immanent, but he has no function. Right? He is anyone precisely because he died like anyone, didn't live the best life. Like the whole point is that he wasn't the best human, right? Then you have the Christian world, where again you have members, you have the body, and you have the king. And again, the king has no function, but he binds the two things together. But this was, let's say, here is one man. This is some man. Perhaps there's a better way of differentiating, right? And then the modern problem is that you have members, you have the body, and every member is divided between having a function and not having a function. There is a useless dimension to this. And this is precisely what you meant. Like, somehow in Kant, he tries to bind people together by this. Sorry, am I speaking?
Yeah, no, it makes sense.
Okay, no, so I just saw that there was a message there. Right, so you see that there is some, and here's any man. And nothing here to make the, so it's the very dimension of what exceeds your place that connects you to everything, right? And you will see this problem here of sovereignty and subjectivity and the subject, right? Because this is how. Let me just add this here on this side now. If we come here, we can say that the modern problem begins with this disjunction, where you have a part that is subject to a system, subject to rules, and sovereign at the same time. As sovereign, it creates the body. As subject, it follows the rules that it itself creates. Right? And then, so Rousseau is the guy who comes up with this scheme, in a certain sense. But then he doesn't think this has a solution, and he says, well, the best way to think these two things together, so general will, so that you can follow the general will and not follow the wills of some particular person, is through popular suffrage and voting. So let's say the majority is the only existing figure of how this duality can have a secular solution. And it's funny because if you continue in the modern paradigm, you see that with Hegel is the guy who takes the division seriously, right? Like, so if we go now to modern philosophy, so Rousseau, he will say that if you have a citizen that is both subject to, here you have the rule, right, and sovereign, that as a popular suffrage, through voting, you create the rules that you will be subject to, and voting is the best way to make these two things equal, so that the things you follow are the things you want. Voting is the only way, the majority is the only way to make sure that this is healthy or harmonious, let's say. Even though the moment he needs to accept that this is just an approximation, he's also saying that in the modern politics there is no unity between the part and the whole. Me as a part, what I create of the whole, will never make it so that the whole represents me as a part, right? Then you have Kant, who will connect, I don't know what we would call the individual perhaps, right? The moral agency, the individual here. You have practical reason. Sorry, you still have the two sovereign and subject. And the moral law connects you to rules that will make you, when you follow them, you're following everyone's interest, right? But this, he never suggests that this coincides now. If you follow the moral law, you don't get to do what you want to do. There's a whole big problem, right? Then Hegel does something that kind of institutionalizes this, because he will say, okay, I have individuals.
Gator, just to stop here, just for a second, you were mentioning that Kant never connects those things, but he actually only says in Critique of Practical Reason that you're only free if you actually do that. Wouldn't that be a connection?
Yeah,
perhaps?
but that's the whole point. He will say you're only truly a subject if you follow rules that were created by the moral law.
Yeah, indeed. But isn't that a connection between the two realms?
No, but I mean, if you read Zupanchit's book on the ethics of the real, the whole point is you don't have an individual experience of your own freedom. Like, you act as free, but that doesn't mean doing what you want to do. You are free, but is freedom the same thing as doing what you want? No.
Oh, no, of course.
Right?
Okay,
This is the difference between, let's say, how is it in German? Like, das Gute und das Wohl, right? The well-being and the good.
Okay, no, I see.
You could even see that this is what happens from the modern paradigm on. Until then, you could always think that this relation between members and body also carries over the idea that the good and the well-being are the same thing. Pause. This is are the same thing in some way. They meet somewhere. Like Kant perhaps is the first guy to extract the consequences that doing good.
Sorry, you cut out for a second. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, like the idea is that until the modern paradigm, what we actually had was the idea that, let's say, the well-being, like we can keep let's say, similarity between well-being and freedom, or the good. Because the pagan world, it was all about harmony, so the well-being of a city is doing good. If you think the city in terms of health, you know, don't cast things aside, everyone has their function and so on, you could make this match. The good of the city is the well-being of a body, right? In the sense of a harmony, organic functioning and so on. This works in the pagan universe, this works in the Greek universe. Then in the Christian one, it already doesn't work very well because the mediation is by something that is sick. This mediation between parts and the whole is precisely by what has no function, right? So this idea that the well-being and the good are connected in this kind of analogous way already doesn't hold well in the Christian event. Then in the Christian world, it's kind of brought back by thinking, well, the king has no function, but it's like the thinking head, you know? The head has a different function than the body. So it doesn't seem to have a function, but it does. And all this debate about what the king actually does. In the modern world, this is totally unacceptable anymore. You can't really think with Kant that if you act in accordance, if you create rules that will be of the general will's interest, that this will mean that you're keeping your well-being in view. Those two things are no longer, you cannot, like the moment you introduce this disjunction, you can no longer think politics in terms of well-being. Because my particular will and the general will that also contemplates me might not match. In any case, this is a kind of extra topic. We don't need to go into this relation between well-being and so on. What I wanted to show simply is that, like Rousseau does this thing where he formalizes the problem. He says, well, citizens are both subjects to rules, but they're sovereign who creates rules. Because this power, sovereign power, now falls onto everyone. It's not only the king who is a sovereign. Everyone is a sovereign. So everyone is divided between these two figures. I mean, the Wittgensteinian problem of rule following. It's exactly this problem. Like, how can I follow rules that I created? Because if there's nothing transcendental guaranteeing, how will I experience them as rules? Right? Because before, there was always a mediator that was not a member. But how can I follow a rule that doesn't come from the outer world? It comes from anyone. What will give it, let's say, the form of a rule? So Rousseau poses this issue, and he poses a distinction between being a sovereign and being a subject simply on the side of the citizen. And the rules are, let's say, univocal. The question is simply what will be the rule that truly is expression of the general will. Now, Hegel does something different because he takes this distinction between subject and sovereign, and he poses it on the side of the rules themselves. He says, well, citizens are like that because they are, on one hand, there is objective spirit and there is subjective spirit. Objective spirit is something that will inform citizenship. Let's say it's the things that institutional dimension that history itself has consolidated from what came before, expectations, ways of doing things, habits, and so on and so forth. And there is a subjective spirit insofar as things that we can institute. But instituting and what is already instituted, those two things also don't match. So, you see the point, like Hegel's the guy who reconstructed all of this. And he shows, look, from all times, the division between function and non-function was already here, between body and stomach, between body and idea, body in Christ, body in King, there was always the division. So it's not that we simply now have a convention to do two things, act as individuals and also as something else. This something else has a history, and it's now immanent to the world. So citizens are both subject and sovereign, but spirit is also both subject and sovereign, so to speak. Subjected to things and also capable of changing things, right? So it's kind of a duality between we want to do something now that we know that we are historical beings, there's no transcendental dimension that prevents something from taking place, but still there are things that when we try to do them one way, they turn out the other way. How can that be? That historical events will have historical consequences that don't match those events. So how can it be that the moment we no longer have, let's say, God organizing the political sphere, it doesn't nonetheless fall on our hands? So Hegel recognized that the sum of the parts is smaller than the whole. The whole still has something more, but this more cannot come from the outer world. Rousseau simply started to turn this into almost a statistical problem. Like the particular wills will not match, and this is where the excess comes from. And Hegel tried to show that there is something more to this excess. The funny thing is that this position that Hegel takes, that there is two sides of spirit, in the sense that when I produce something, I don't control what I produce. So as a citizen, I can, as a sovereign citizen, produce a rule that when it's applied to me as a subject, I don't control the rule. So I'm different from myself as a rule maker and as a rule follower, not because I can never come up with a proper rule, but because rules move on without me somehow. They become things that I didn't anticipate. So rules are different from themselves, right? Well, Feuerbach read this as a display that Hegel was still too religious a thinker. Like, how can things that I create move autonomously without me? That's religious thinking. See, he didn't think that Hegel had found the secular core that made religion, to which religion was an answer. He thought that he was simply promoting religious thinking in the secular sphere. So you get to Feuerbach, and he tries to remove that dimension. Right? He says, well, I can take, what is this? This is not spirit. This is the fact that man, as a living being, can think his own life as an object and contemplate it. This is true universality. This is how the common point of view appears. When man thinks humanity as such, like the fact that we can contemplate humanity, that's how me as a person or as an individual gets connected to me as a universal. So, but now in a kind of self-reflexive way, because the thing that is beyond me is me, in an ontological way. Whereas for Hegel, the thing that is beyond me, even though I created this beyond, it really is beyond me. Like, it's funny because you can see how more materialistic in a certain sense Hegel was. He says, not only can I create, like, I'm not simply saying that the beyond is a creation of man, but that man can create something that is beyond. Even let's say the act of making something beyond is also an activity, historical activity. Whereas Feuerbach kind of re-ontologizes this beyond and says, well, everything is in this plane. So how can I create something that is not from this plane, from within it? It's impossible. So everything that man creates is at his own image somehow. So this link between me and the products of what I do are kept. Marx comes in and he takes this, and you can see now that we're further, like there is a history of incarnation within modern thinking, right? We went from Rousseau and general will to Hegel, and it's kind of hard to put Hegel here, but a kind of spirit, not really what I will, but the spirit of what I will, so that if the two don't match, too bad for me. Then you have Feuerbach, who says, well, it's much more materialistic to think not in terms of this abstract spirit, but in terms of life. And then you get to Marx, who says, well, but this thing that Feuerbach thinks that is the species, right, as a natural unity of all men, through which I, as a particular man, do my life, but since I'm from the same species of other men, this connects me to the universal. Marx thinks labor does this. So for Marx, labor is the thing that when I'm doing it, working, I change myself and I change what it means to be a man. So again, as a part, I do something. This thing that I do has an effect on the whole, on the subsistence of the whole, on the concept of justice, on the mediation in politics, and blah, 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 blah. It's the, let's say, the material base of all of those mediations, right? And this mediation then changes what it means to be man and so on. But the problem is that he has, this is his first answer, and then his second answer is the form of value. Because he realizes that there's actually more historical ways of mediating between men, and he realizes that actually the form of value, labor is not ontologically mediator of people. It's actually the form of value that in capitalism mediates between labor. So that's, let's say, the shift towards capital, right? I'm going too quick here, but just because what I wanted to show is that when we get to the 20th century, and I think Lenin here is the guy, we have a problem. Like, it's a very interesting thing, because all of this, you see, like, you only need the idea of organ and organism, because the body was harmonious and the organ had a function. Here in the Christian, you also have you start to have something that is mediating. It's concrete, but it has a mediating factor. And also, as a mediating factor, it serves no particular purpose. Like, it doesn't have a function in the body. Well, the thing that doesn't have a function in the body, but organizes the body, but it's not in the outer world, is precisely the formal dimension of organization. But this is still figured here as a person, figured as a position. Then in modern times, it falls onto everyone. And this is when problems of organization start to appear. People start thinking in terms of organization as something that is neither organ or organism with the modern age. Nobody used the word organization before that. And then you have a theory of what is the standpoint that organization should be seen from. People are organized. Like, organization is a matter of how do you connect different wills, how do you think their relation. Organization is a matter of the way spirit disposes of a certain disjunction in history. Organization is the very organization of a species. So not the organism, again, because it's not the species is not an organism, but it's, let's say, a historical disposition of different forms and so on. Then you get to Marx and the very organization of daily life, and the subsistence of one person through labor is also what binds the subsistence of the species itself. But it's not the species that exists. What exists is the labor of reproducing life in the individual level. Then he realizes that this is not ontological, this is historical, because, for example, in the capitalist mode of production, the way that the form of value organizes the places of labor, the quality of labor, the food, the housing, everything, comes from the disposition of the division of labor and so on and so forth, right? But the problem, so this appears as a central issue, but it's still not totally clear. And it's funny that Lenin kind of returns to Rousseau in a way, because what is the Rousseau, let's say, Rousseauian idea of party? Party is when you have a part with similar wills, and it will represent its interests to the whole. And it's always a pluripartidarian system, where I have a part and I have another part, and with different interests, and they're going to come together in a certain forum where we will get the closest possible to the general will. Well, Lenin thinks of a party, and no such party existed before him, that doesn't want to be the representative of a particular will. It wants to represent the common will, the interest of everyone. So you see how it's a part that wants to create immanent, it wants to mediate immanently between the parts. It's a part that wants to be the whole, just like Christ wants to be the head and the body. So it's a theory of a mediator that is not in the same sense of a particular will. Well, at that point, I mean, if you read the history of parties, like, okay, the Communist Manifesto has in the title Manifesto of the Communist Party. But if you read historically, the word party before Lenin only meant one of two things. Either that you take part in a certain idea, so I'm partisan to this partidaire or partisan to this mode of thinking. So it doesn't mean that we're going to organize together. It means that we agree. So a party based on, let's say, agreement. That's what the Manifesto of the Communist Party means. People who take part or are of the side of communism. Proudhon, who was an anarchist against party, he used like the party of the revolution. It means people who are in favor of the revolution. Or either this or the bourgeois notion of party as representation. Parts of the society are gonna, through the mediation of the representative system, bring their interests to the state, to the whole, right? Well, the Leninist party is the first time that the word party means it takes something of the representative in the sense that it binds people together in action, but at the same time, it's more like the agreement than the representation. So it's not really a representative party. It's a party that presents people. It wants to bind and mediate immanently the relation between the civil society and those excluded from the civil society. But the problem is that Marx named the mediating factor. So let's erase all of this. Marx names the mediating factor binding together the parts and the whole, labor, right? Or either labor or value. And none of the two are names for what Lenin needs, right? We have here parts of the society. You have here the whole. You have here representative system. And you have here the idea of Communist Party, who seeks even to destroy the representative system. So it's the idea that this thing here will mediate differently than this thing here. Right? Why? And it's funny because if you consider the word party for a communist party, it makes no sense because your purpose is not to win an election to represent persons' interests. So it's particular a party with non-functional from the standpoint of the whole. So the problem is that the names for this mediation, this immanent mediation, were labor, value. Those are things that organize life, the relation between parts, and turn in mediating activities. But both of them are capitalist. So how can he use these terms to think the standpoint of organization that is not going to reproduce the world as it is, reproduce the relations of production? And this is where Lenin seems to have found a problem, because he wants to think now that organization is the name of the mediation. That's the name that he adds here. And he makes a distinction. That's the new distinction. He says organization as subject. He says not labor, not value, but organization is the name of a way of doing things that connects the parts to the whole without having to transcend, to bring in religion or anything, but directed by this common standpoint. But the funny thing is that you have only organization as subject, as let's say, what follows a certain path. But organization was not substance. Let's say organization didn't have a being. So, for example, you will find in Lenin's writings a lot of stuff on what to do, how to act, how to move forward, but none on what moving forward as an organization produces in terms of resistances, immanent problems of organization. Those things don't really concern him. And it's funny that the Bolshevik party was in fact divided from the inside by this distinction. You have the Bolshevik Party, and you have Bogdanov, and you have Lenin. They were both leaders of the Bolshevik Party. One had the theory of organization as subject, so discipline, politics, sometimes very closely connected to religious thinking, so on and so forth. And on the other hand, you had Bogdanov, who will be studied here a bit, thinking organization as substance. So complex systems theory, science, the idea that when you think that the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts in a totally secular, natural sense, you manage to understand phenomena from nature that you couldn't before. So he was like a critique of the notion of organism to the notion of organization. There is no harmony in nature. And it's interesting because Lenin included in his theory of organization the disjunction, the conflict between organization and the world. Like, organizations had to rethink themselves all the time in order to adapt to new forms of struggle and so on. And Bogdanov also had a theory of conflict because, I don't know if you guys remember, but for him, knowledge depends on the conflict between two forms of organization. The resistance of nature to labor, for example, is how we learn about nature. If nature didn't resist labor, we wouldn't know nature exists. So he had a conflicting theory of organization as substance. We have a conflicting theory of organization as subject, so fighting and subjectivizing contradictory people, the peasants, the working class, and so on. But these two theories didn't connect. So it's funny because we recognize within Marxism the need to think organization as something that has a being, and the thinking of organization as something that has a power, but we didn't manage to bring the two together. Why is this important? Because you can have popular power, but you can work it against the being of your organization. One thing can actually get in the way of the other. Right? You can organize in a way that this power then gets in the hand of few people. Not because they're evil people, but because the very being of organization, the way it's structured, kind of permits the accumulation of power in the hands of few. Right? So what to close the problem, to finish this whole thing, so what I've been thinking about is where was this problem thematized? Because Hegel did thematize it in terms of objective and subjective spirit. Objective spirit is something like organization as substance, things that are simply material about the way organization works. You cannot avoid them. It's like the very logic of organization in a given historical moment. And organization as subject is precisely, let's say, the way this organization, this way of doing things, actually comes up to find its own inner contradictions, changes into something else, how it can be changed by people, and so on. So where is this problem? Two sides of this problem is connected, right? The only place I've seen this is in Zizek. Like, he reconstructs this Hegelian phenomenology of the transcendental material dimension. He takes this idea that modernity carries over the religious problem. He's the one who criticizes Lenin for having a theory of knowledge that doesn't include this contradictory dimension of being, right? As if organization would raise him to a level where, you know, everything that I can include into the organization, I can know, and this inclusion doesn't prove itself an obstacle to organization. In other terms, there are no immanent problems of organizing something. But I found a stepping stone that I wanted to end this meeting on it, which is Sartre's a critique of dialectical reason. And I wanted to show that this is an interesting perspective because Sartre distinguishes in the book, like it's in English it's 2 volumes, each one has 700 pages, and it's unfinished. But the first volume is dedicated to logical or formal construction, though there are a lot of phenomenological examples, of the limits of different forms of collection of people, right? The subtitle of the book is A Theory of Practical Ensembles, a theory of practical sets. And I wanted to schematize them for you and to show how when we have this idea that somehow the problem of modernity is how embedded into the world the mediator is, and how more as it is embedded, the organizations become problematic and hard to maintain, right? And how this is, let's say, it is this the standpoint from which we need to understand the pathologies of organization. When an organization fails and thinks that that guy was responsible or this or that happened, we need to look how much we're not returning, in a certain sense, to previous ways of dealing with this excess. So either from the ideal standpoint, let's say a Greek pathology, either from the sacrifice standpoint, from the Christian event pathology, either from the authoritarian perspective when we have this kingship pathology. No, they're all ways of trying to answer to the fact that there is some immanent excess. Those who are organized somehow don't have the power over the organization they compose. This difference, where through which the organization is more than them, but less than something totally transcendental to them. What to do with that? When we treat this problem as real, we can, let's say, we have a privileged standpoint to think the pathologies of the organization. So, I think Sartre makes a good typology to begin with, because he divides organizations into 4 groups. He calls them collectives, groups proper, organizations, and institutions. So I extracted from the book a couple put this a bit higher. A couple of special aspects that seems to be the ones that mediate the passage between these things. So just try to make this a bit. Hope this works. So, for example, cohesion. What Sartre does, he says, well, collectives are those groups that are externally, their cohesion comes from the outside. For example, a queue, when you're in a bank, in a queue, it's not really that you have a relation to other people in the queue so much that you all have a relation to something external. For example, you want to do different things in the bank, but the fact that there's a role you need to be in, right? So these constraints are external to the group. So when the constraints are external, he calls it a collective. He has a name for these external constraints. He calls them the practical inert. Like this form of practical inertia, that your practice kind of needs to adequate itself because that's the easiest, the least resistance path, but not because there is some sort of unity in the collective. Then the level of groups, this is what becomes internal. So the group has internal cohesion. The group is bound together by something that actually binds the people that are there together. But the group has, as an object, something that is external to it. So for example, just as the collectives also, like I want to go to the bank to cash a check, you want to go to the bank to open an account. The objective is external, and since the cohesion is also external, it's not even the same object necessarily. So it's also external. In the case of the group, it's normally an action, doing something, so this something is out there, but since the cohesion is internal, let's say the object mediates the cohesion. So it's normally one common object. The purpose, the private finality of getting that objective accomplished might be different, but there is something outside that is one and unifies the group because of it, right? Well, this is the first thing that defines an organization for Sartre, because for him, the organization has internal cohesion like the group, but it has an internal object, meaning that it can think itself. Just a second, guys. Alô? Eu? Ah, o Alex? saiu? Putz, tá bom. Deixa eu entrar. Caraca. Sorry. So, just open the door here. So Sartre distinguishes groups from organizations in the sense that, okay, organizations might have external objects, but they can also have internal objects. Like a company, it can have meetings about how the company is going. It can take itself as an object without ceasing to be the collective that it is. So this is a novelty about the organization, right? But at the same time, let's say its product, in the case of collectives, it's external. Queues don't think themselves. There's no point of, if I were to turn to people who are in the same queue as me and say, guys, we need to do something here about this queue, it's badly organized or something, I already move away from the collective into something like a group, because now this object is internal to us, but the moment that I change it, I'm no longer that queue, it's a different queue and so on. So it's not really that simple. Then the groups, the product is also external to them. Yeah. In the organization, it's also external. For example, in a company, you do something, like for example, product, but it's not the reproduction of the company. Reproducing the company is just so you can continue to produce surplus value or whatever you want, right? This is what an institution has that's different. Institutions has internal cohesion. They have internal objects, like they can think themselves, change their own protocols and so on. But they also have an internal product. The product of an institution is to reproduce itself as an institution, right? So you could say that collectives are passive, groups are active, organizations are productive, and institutions are reproductive. The funny thing is that from the standpoint of reproduction, what is the cohesion of an institution? It's no longer cohesion in action, nor cohesion in knowledge or activity, right? It's cohesion in inertia, again. Like, I don't need to believe an institution for me to be cohesive with it. The whole thing about the law and the transgression falls here. Actually, I have a better name for this than product. For example, the problem with desire. It's actually a better issue to consider. Like desire, as we said, it's external to the collective. It's actually external to the group because even though I have an external object, I don't know why it is that people desire the same object. It is external to the organization because if people don't desire to produce the same thing, or they're not there because they want, like, they have some reason to be there, the organization simply is not concerned with them. The organization only concerns with those who desire to be in the organization in some sense. Whereas in the case of institutions, institutions have meaning both for people who are in and who are out. Like the whole thing with the law and the transgression. That's why it's reproductive. Even when you escape it, you're still in it. In an organization, if you're out of it, you're still out. You're not in, right? We could call it here outside instead of desire, just to make it simpler. Outsider or whatever, right? And it's funny because this thing here, this passage from externality to internality is the problem of formation. The form is immanent to the group, whereas it was extrinsic to the collective. From the group to the organization, when the organization can take itself as an object, it means it can think its structure. There is now structure, formation, structure, and the moment that the outside is also in the organization, is a problem of events. Something that's totally heterogeneous falls within, right? So you could say that collectives are groups without formation, or groups are organizations without structure. Organizations are institutions that cannot handle events. So that's like, and I wanted to show that there is this kind of like this level here from collective to institution is precisely the way organizations manage to absorb more and more of this mediating aspect, right? The mediation through the oneness, mediation through structure, mediation through even heterogeneous things that take place to everyone, right? Events meaning things that happen to everyone, like that, right? And this gives them like slightly different characteristics. So it's nice to see like we can actually construct a complex typology of how the field of organization can be distinguished from the standpoint of how much of this excess it can actually carry it over, into itself. So yeah, this is what I'm studying right now. Any complex questions?
So this movement between, so what is the first one? Organization? No,
Yeah,
it's
collective, groups, organization, and institutions.
So in this movement, what happens to the individual?
Well, good question. Yeah, I would say even that this outsider here can be the individual itself, right? Because, for example, you could say that collectives don't really care about life in the sense of reproduction of life. It's not really an issue internal to how things are being collected. In groups, the problem of life is totally outside. It's mobilized for an action. Living people are needed to accomplish some action, but it's not something that is touched upon by the very organization, right? Where organizations themselves don't really concern life, like they can. I mean, this is a classic company thing. You're paid for the reproduction of your labor force, but the actual reproduction of it doesn't take place in the organization. Like organization, normally it pays you, but the time the way in which you will consume that money is your problem. Right? For consumption is outside of the organization. Another way of thinking this, like consumption, which is still part of the institution of the form of value, doesn't fall within the company. It falls somewhere else. Right? At the level of institution, this dimension of reproduction of life itself, in the case of economy, the problem of consumption, falls within the organization. The moment that this falls within, right, you have something that's slightly distinct from organization, from groups, and from collective.
Yeah, I see. So like consumption here stands for that aspect which is again useless, right? Like insofar it's the goal, right? The end point, which doesn't really serve any purpose.
Yeah, exactly. Doesn't serve. Yeah, another way would be to say that. Like I put event here because precisely something that doesn't really, like, it's not really the level of purpose, right? Here, perhaps instead of event, we could have put useless, right? Purposelessness. There cannot be an organization without a purpose, but there can be institutions with no purpose. In that sense, not that it doesn't have rules, tasks, and functions, but like really? I'm sharing my screen all this time. Dude, just tell me something. You guys were not looking at this board all the time.
I'm trying to.
Sorry?
Yeah, no, we were looking at the QuickTime video showed it, but it was on the corner of your screen.
Yeah, you could have told me that before, perhaps.
Sure, I thought you knew for some reason until no.
No, I didn't, but it's okay. Anyway, so perhaps this might. I'm not sure if you can see it properly now, but Yeah, the idea, I think this purposelessness aspect here is more, perhaps the better name than event, even though this is how some of these guys mention it. The idea that, like, at this level, you introduce action, like people can act in common. At the organization level, you introduce the problem of tasks and functions. That's why it introduces structure, right? But at the level of institution, you introduce the level of signification even. Like, if you do something, it has a meaning. If you don't do something, it also has a meaning. There's no way to be outside its own scope, right? Precisely because it touches on purposelessness. And that's how meaning is constituted, right? So, what I like about this is that suddenly we have a bit of a typology with which to think how something is constituted, because within an institution you can have organizations, groups, and collectives. Organizations have subgroups and collectives and so on, depending on how much of this they bear, right? And the whole point is that what I think it's missing here now that I want to include is that the way Sartre does this is that he takes institutions to be the ossified problem. Like, everything is internal, therefore it's some sort of totalitarian thing. And it seems to me that this is not the case. You could totally see that if this is the problem of purposelessness that falls within the institution, it has a place for freedom, whereas organization has no place for freedom within it, right? And this is more of the Hegelian view of it. So that's what I'm working right now, like how to make this reproductive dimension of institutions something that has a positive spin and not simply something negative.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it seems to repeat the same passage that you were discussing earlier with Rousseau and Hegel.
Yes, exactly.
Like how to handle this like excess, right? But it seems to go like the other way now, because the institution is capable of bearing the most excess, but it's also the most ossified form, right?
Yeah, and that's the funny thing, like, because it seems to me like the Hegelian twist in the end is that what is practical inert here about collectives, like the fact that you get into a queue in the bank through totally extrinsic reasons, it's precisely what makes you free in the institution, right? Like, that this is the way to follow within an institution and that you don't need to think about it. That's precisely why some free space is open for you. You don't need to be like purposefully engaged, not even in terms of action, nor in terms of function, to have a place in an institution. Like, in terms of organizations, cohesion is internal. Why? Because it has some sort of purpose that it wants to accomplish. Like a company has a product it creates. The object is internal in the sense that it can reflect upon its own structure to bring about that purpose, right? But people who are not in the company are simply not of concern of the company. If they're not in demographics, not in anything that can be transformed in terms of tasks, functions, and so on, there's no place for them there. The whole point of a company, the whole thing that we listen to time and time again is, let's cut costs, cut corners, because only keep the essential personnel, right? But in an institution, first, the internal cohesion comes in a way that you don't need to identify with it. You don't need to have a common purpose. Second, the object, it's totally autonomous to me. I can make a critique of an institution and at the same time apply the institution's principles. That's the crazy. In organizations proper, you cannot do that. In a company, you cannot be criticizing though companies tend to mimic this, right? Like to have a place where you can file complaints, but at the same time, it's kind of ineffective. You cannot really ever come to fruition that sort of change you're proposing. Here, you can even come to fruition. You can even change the institution, but it's so autonomous to you, the rules of the institution, that you have an experience of estrangement, not simply of reflection. And this precisely because you have an inertial relation to cohesion, an estrangement relation to the rules, that even if you're unidentified and not following the rule, still you have a place in the institution. It has a name for you. Your action means something, right? So it seems like it's no wonder that Hegel wanted to. This is like a theory of objective spirit, right? And it's funny because that's why the reason why I wanted to reconstruct this is because it seems like the Hegelian idea of objective spirit appears as the most incarnate version of that mediating excess of organization, and not incarnate enough, you know.
Yeah, because another example of institution would be, this role of excess would be like prisoners in the state, right? Like if you're a criminal, you're not really outside of the state. Like the state includes a place for even those who don't follow the rules of the state.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's why like the whole analysis of like Foucaultian analysis or analysis of institutions, right? The school has a name for people who don't go to school, don't go well in school, and people who have, the state has a name. Prison is a system that is both in and outside the law, right? The law itself, right? The law says needs to write down what is a crime, right? It's not simply the opposite of crime.
So this theory was developed in which text by Sartre?
The Critique of Dialectical Reason, but he doesn't develop it this way. He develops it in this kind of, shows a collective, and he says, well, when a collective grasps itself as a collective, it becomes a group because its cohesion now is part of itself, and it has an object of something that it wants to accomplish. Like, it gives a more historical, formative view rather than this kind of typological one. But when I reconstructed it like this, that I saw that he had some problems. And then I read this other guy called René Leroux, a French guy from the 60s, 70s, who, after reading Sartre and studying psychoanalysis and so on and so forth, and he's a Hegelian, he reconstructed it, trying to propose a more positive dimension for the institution. Because the idea that he adds that institutions, like sociology, hasn't really managed to think institutions properly, because it always thinks institutions in terms of what is already there, never as the sort of action that produces something that once it's been produced, it acts as it was already here. So this kind of autonomous dimension of rules, right? And he tries to show that institution must be the problem of both sides, not simply of one side. And with this, he adds back this dimension of mediators that go in excess to what they mediate, but this is ambivalent. It can actually, good things can come out of it as well as bad things and something like that. But that's pretty much where I'm right now. I think that this is not cohesion object, and I don't know, you see that I don't really know how to name this third thing here. Still thinking about it. It seems to me like if you reconstruct the way we did it today, we had this historical narrative, and then it kind of opens into kind of a sea, right? It was a river, then we get to the modern sea, and the problem is we have one issue, one impasse, and many people trying to solve the same impasse, not new impasses, the same problem. And I think you find it in a division in the Bolshevik party there, as I proposed, how to think the organization as something that is kind of reified and has causal effect on the organized people, and also organization as something that is a way to kind of consolidate and condensate the will of the people to produce some change, right? So, but they never thought these two things together, and I think that the history that interests me is then the modern history of how these two things go together. Because it's like, this is I think the truly Marxist reconstruction of the problem of the unconscious, with no reference to psychoanalysis and no improper importations, right? Like, there is an inner logic to organizations themselves and to collective activity, where you will have, let's say, organization as substance and as subject, as something that potentializes the expression of something, but it's because this is a material expression, it also will change those who organize themselves. In the same way, but in an analogous or homologous way, as to which representations in speech permit us to express more than we would otherwise, but because this is still material and happens in the world, the effects of this on us are not contained in our will to express, right? So, but with no need to go through psychoanalysis. That's what I think is important. So we could immanently reconstruct this problem within Marxism. So that's where I'm at right now. It seems like labor theory, value theory, Lenin's theory of the party, they all brush on one side of, like, actually Marx brushes on one side of it through labor and commodity. Lenin brushes on the other side, so organization as agency and as subject. Bogdanov tries to include within that standpoint the Marxist standpoint, the critique of political economy standpoint, but the disjunction between the two is never finds a field, unified field to be thought. It still remains like two sides of the coin, you know? Just like as we were talking then, is about class struggle demanding action, demanding diagnosis of a conjuncture so that we can act on it, and value theory, diagnosis of conjuncture so that we get to see historical global movements with no place for action, but the material constraints of an era appear. So the value would be, let's say, the standpoint of capital as substance, class struggle, the standpoint of capital as subject, but we never get to a theory that unifies both, you know? Or at least a theory of why they are not unifiable.
Yeah, it's really good, man. It's like this presentation really condenses a lot of the really important points.
Yeah, I think it's clarifying some stuff for me at least. Guys, I'll need to go now because apparently we have another meeting soon, and I'm gonna probably skip it and leave Alex doing the meeting while I don't do it.
Okay.
Okay, guys.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Pretty nice.
Thank you, guys.